What happens to an idea that arrives before the world knows how to hold it? History often presents itself as a steady march, discovery after discovery, each brick laid neatly on the path of progress. But if you listen closely, beneath that orderly rhythm, there is another sound, a softer one. The echo of questions left unanswered, of inventions hinted at, demonstrated briefly, then fading from view like lights switched off at dawn. At the turn of the 20th century, the world stood at the edge of transformation. Electricity was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming the nervous system of modern life. Cities glowed, machines hummed. Human ambition crackled in the air, as tangible as ozone after a storm. It was an age intoxicated by possibility, and uneasy about where possibility might lead. This story begins not with certainty, but with tension. In workshops, basements, and improvised laboratories, inventors pursued ideas that refused to fit comfortably inside accepted frameworks. Some chased energy that seemed to come from nowhere. Others explored the hidden behavior of matter, sound, magnetism, or light. Their language was often poetic rather than precise. Their methods sometimes clashed with emerging scientific standards, and yet for brief moments they convinced witnesses that something extraordinary had occurred. A motor that ran without fuel, a tower that sent power through open air, stones that appeared to move as if relieved of their weight. These accounts, fragmentary, contested, deeply human, were not always wrong, but they were rarely tidy. They lived in the uncomfortable space between imagination and verification. And that space, history has never known quite what to do with. As institutions hardened, universities, corporations, governments, so too did the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. Science became more rigorous but also more conservative. Ideas that could not be reliably reproduced were set aside. Ideas that threatened existing systems were quietly deprioritized. Not necessarily erased by villainy, but often by neglect, skepticism, or economic reality. Progress, after all, is not only about what we discover, it is also about what we choose to develop. The stories that follow are not accusations, they are reflections. They are about moments when human curiosity reached outward, sometimes too far, sometimes too fast, and encountered resistance not just from authority, but from the limits of understanding itself. Some of these inventions may have been misunderstood, some exaggerated, some flawed from the beginning. Others perhaps brushed against truths that required generations to fully articulate. What unites them is not proof, but pattern. Again and again we encounter the same arc. An inventor working at the edge of convention, a demonstration that inspires awe or disbelief, a surge of attention followed by silence. Records thin out, prototypes disappear, reputations fracture. What remains are questions passed down like heirlooms, polished by retelling, dulled by doubt. It is tempting to frame these moments as battles between heroes and villains, geniuses and suppressors. But reality is quieter and more complex. History is shaped less by grand conspiracies than by incentives, fears, and timing. An idea may be set aside simply because the world is not ready to absorb its consequences. And yet, the emotional core persists. These stories resonate because they mirror something deeply human, the sense that possibility is fragile, that progress is not guaranteed, that entire futures can hinge on who is listening, who is funding, who is afraid. In the decades that followed, humanity would solve many problems these inventors struggled with, often using different tools, different language, different theories. But the original questions never fully disappeared. They lingered in the margins of textbooks, in footnotes, in half-forgotten patents, and personal letters. This documentary is not about reclaiming forbidden truths. It is about revisiting moments when imagination pressed hard against the limits of its time, about honoring the tension between wonder and restraint, between what can be imagined and what can be responsibly built. So, as we begin this journey, hold both curiosity and caution. Not every lost invention was a breakthrough. Not every forgotten idea was a tragedy. But each one tells us something about how societies decide which futures to pursue and which to leave behind. And perhaps the most important question is not whether these inventions truly worked, but what it says about us that we are still wondering. What if energy didn't belong to anyone at all? On a stretch of Long Island shoreline at the dawn of the 20th century, a tall wooden tower rose against the sky. It looked unfinished, more like a question than an answer. Its purpose was not obvious to passers-by, and perhaps that was fitting. The man behind it believed the most transformative ideas often arrived disguised as impractical dreams. Nikola Tesla was already famous by then. His work with alternating current had helped electrify cities and industries, shaping the modern world in ways few inventors ever would. Yet to Tesla, that success felt incomplete. Wires still tethered power to infrastructure. Energy flowed along lines owned, measured, and controlled. He imagined something different, an invisible web of transmission, where electricity moved through air and earth as naturally as sound or light. Tesla spoke of resonance, of the planet itself behaving like a tuned instrument capable of carrying vibrations across vast distances. If energy could be synchronized with the Earth's natural rhythms, he believed, power might be shared without cables, fuel, or boundaries. The tower, later known as Wardenclyffe, was designed as an experiment in that belief. Witnesses at the time described demonstrations that felt almost theatrical. Lamps glowing without wires, motors turning without visible connections. These moments were brief and imperfect, but they captured the public imagination. For a short while, it seemed plausible that electricity might someday be something you simply received, the way a radio receives a signal, yet possibility has a cost. Tesla's vision was elegant, but it collided with practical realities. Power grids required investment. Investors required returns. A system that delivered energy freely without meters or ownership posed uncomfortable questions. How would it be regulated, monetized, controlled? These were not moral objections so much as structural ones. An economy built on scarcity struggles to adapt to abundance. Funding slowed. Support wavered. The tower stood unfinished, its promise suspended between ambition and uncertainty. When the project was eventually abandoned, it was not accompanied by dramatic announcements, just a quiet withdrawal of interest. Years later, the structure was dismantled and the land repurposed. The experiment dissolved into history. After Tesla's death, his papers were gathered, cataloged, and debated. Some saw brilliance. Others saw speculation ungrounded in reproducible science. Modern physics would later clarify many of the limits Tesla could not fully articulate, while also validating aspects of his intuition about waves, fields, and resonance. Wireless power in constrained forms would eventually become real, charging devices across small distances, transmitting signals across the globe. But not in the way Tesla imagined. What lingers is not proof of a lost miracle, but a lingering sense of divergence, a moment when a different path seemed possible, then quietly closed. Tesla's dream of planetary-scale wireless energy was less a finished invention than a provocation, a challenge to how humanity organizes access to resources. In retrospect, it is tempting to frame Wardenclyffe as a suppressed breakthrough. It is equally tempting to dismiss it as an overreach. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Tesla was reaching toward a future that required not just new technology, but new economic and social frameworks. Without those, even the most inspired ideas struggle to survive. Yet the emotional weight of the story endures. Because Tesla was not only asking, "Can we do this?" He was asking, should energy belong to everyone? And perhaps more uncomfortably, what happens when technology outruns the systems meant to contain it? Today, as the world grapples with energy inequality, sustainability, and access, Tesla's unfinished tower feels less like a failure and more like a mirror. It reflects a recurring tension in human progress. Innovation is rarely limited by imagination alone, but by the structures that decide which imaginations are allowed to matter. And so the question remains, not whether power could ever flow freely through the air, but whether we are willing to build a world where its benefits are shared as boldly as its possibilities. Can healing come from harmony rather than force? In the early decades of the 20th century, medicine was changing its language. Germ theory had sharpened its focus. Surgery grew more precise. Drugs promised targeted solutions to complex diseases. Yet alongside this progress, there remained a quieter curiosity, an intuition that life might be governed not only by chemistry, but by rhythm. Some researchers began to wonder whether illness was less an invasion and more a disruption. If cells had patterns, electrical, mechanical, vibrational, then perhaps restoring balance mattered as much as destroying pathogens. It was an idea that felt ancient and modern at the same time, echoing both musical metaphors and emerging theories of electromagnetism. Among those drawn to this possibility were inventors who built devices as much like instruments as machines. They spoke of frequencies, resonance, and selective response. Their hope was deceptively simple. If every structure has a natural vibration, then maybe disease could be addressed by tuning rather than cutting. Demonstrations were described in careful tones, microscopes that appeared to reveal movement others could not see, devices that emitted specific pulses of energy, patients who reported improvement when conventional treatments had failed. For a brief period, the idea that illness could be influenced by finely calibrated fields felt plausible enough to deserve attention. But medicine, unlike music, demands reproducibility. As these claims spread, so did scrutiny. Independent verification proved difficult. Equipment was complex, fragile, and often idiosyncratic, built by hand, adjusted by intuition, explained in language that sat uneasily with standardized methodology. The gap between observation and explanation widened, and with it, skepticism hardened. Institutions responded cautiously. Medical boards emphasized peer review. Journals asked for controlled trials. Regulators worried about false hope, about patients abandoning proven treatments for unverified alternatives. In this environment, frequency-based healing found itself on unstable ground, not fully embraced, not entirely dismissed, but increasingly marginalized. The emotional stakes, however, were profound. Cancer, chronic illness, degenerative disease, these are not abstract problems. They carry urgency, fear, and desperation. Any claim of a gentler cure attracts attention, and any suggestion that such a cure might be overlooked or rejected can feel like a moral failing rather than a procedural one. Over time, the language surrounding these early frequency experiments shifted. What began as speculative research became framed by supporters as suppressed truth, and by critics as pseudoscience. The middle ground, uncertain, incomplete, but curious, largely disappeared from a public conversation. And yet, the core question refused to vanish. Modern medicine now openly acknowledges that cells communicate electrically, that biofields exist, that resonance matters, from MRI machines to targeted radiation therapies. The idea that energy interacts with biology is no longer controversial. It is foundational. What remains debated is how far that interaction can be guided, controlled, or therapeutically tuned. In hindsight, those early frequency researchers may not have found the answers they sought. Their tools were limited, their theories incomplete, but their intuition, that health is not only about destruction, but about balance, has quietly endured. What history shows us here is not a lost miracle cure, but a lesson in timing. Some ideas arrive before the language exists to test them properly. Others carry emotional weight so heavy that objectivity becomes difficult to maintain. When hope meets uncertainty, the result is rarely clarity. Still, there is something deeply human in the attempt to look at illness and imagine not a battlefield, but an orchestra. To believe that healing might come from listening as much as intervening. Even if the instruments were flawed, the impulse itself speaks to a desire for compassion in science. Perhaps the real story is not about whether these machines worked, but about how medicine chooses which questions to pursue and which to postpone. Because every era draws its own boundaries around what counts as reasonable inquiry. And sometimes, long after the debate has cooled, we discover that the question was worth asking after all. What if falling were not inevitable? Gravity is the most familiar of forces. It holds our feet to the ground, shapes the paths of planets, and quietly reminds us of limits we rarely challenge. For centuries, to question gravity was not just scientific curiosity, it bordered on heresy. And yet, every so often, someone looks at what seems immovable and wonders whether it might be persuaded. In the early 20th century, as electricity transformed industry and warfare, a handful of physicists noticed something peculiar. Under certain conditions, charged objects appeared to behave strangely, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to provoke curiosity. If electricity could influence motion, could it also whisper to gravity itself? One researcher followed that whisper with unusual persistence. Through years of experimentation, he observed that electrically charged components, simple arrangements of plates and fields, sometimes produced a measurable force, not thrust in the conventional sense. No exhaust, no propeller, no flame, just motion. Subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore. The effect suggested a coupling between electrical charge and gravitational behavior, a relationship not predicted by accepted theory. The idea was radical. Gravity, according to Einstein, was the curvature of space-time, not something you pushed against with a voltage. And yet, experimental results seemed to hint that nature might be more interconnected than equations allowed. Demonstrations followed, disc-shaped devices gliding along tracks, systems that moved silently, driven only by high-voltage fields. Observers described the experience as unsettling, not because it was dramatic, but because it violated expectations without announcing itself. The devices did not roar, they simply went. At a time when aviation was advancing rapidly, such behavior drew attention, not from the public, but from institutions tasked with imagining the future of mobility and defense. Quiet interest replaced open debate. Research shifted settings. Conversations moved behind closed doors. And then, abruptly, the trail grew cold. Public discussion of electrogravitic concepts faded. Funding redirected. Papers stopped appearing. Patents were classified or quietly absorbed. Official explanations suggested the experiments had reached practical limits, or that the effects were too weak to matter. The question of whether electricity and gravity were linked was not definitively answered. It was simply set aside. This is where interpretation becomes delicate. Some see suppression, a technology too transformative to release. Others see disappointment, an effect real but insufficient, overshadowed by jets and rockets that worked reliably. Both readings reflect deeper truths. History often advances not by choosing the best idea, but the most scalable one. Yet the emotional residue remains. Because the dream of overcoming gravity is not about convenience. It is about freedom. To hover, to rise without violence, to move without consuming the world beneath you. Anti-gravity, even as a concept, represents an aspiration to transcend brute force with elegance. Modern physics has not closed the door entirely. Research into electromagnetic fields, vacuum energy, and space-time manipulation continues carefully, incrementally. Engineers still chase propulsion systems that reduce mass, drag, and fuel dependence. The language has changed, but the curiosity persists. Looking back, those early electrogravitic experiments occupy a liminal space. They may not have been the key to flight without fuel, but they were a reminder that the forces we treat as fundamental may still have relationships we do not fully understand. And perhaps that is the real lesson. Science is not a catalog of final answers. It is a process of asking better questions. Some questions are postponed because the tools are not ready. Others because the implications are too disruptive to integrate quickly. In both cases, the inquiry does not vanish. It waits. So when we ask whether gravity can be challenged, we are really asking something else. How willing are we to rethink what feels permanent? Because every age believes it understands the rules of reality until the next one discovers the margins were wider than imagined. What if energy listened before it moved? In the 19th century, before physics learned to speak fluently in equations, it often spoke in metaphors. Nature was described as mechanical, musical, even alive. Vibrations were not abstractions, they were felt, heard, and trusted. In that intellectual climate, the idea that matter itself might respond to sound did not seem unreasonable. It seemed poetic, perhaps even logical. One inventor took that poetry seriously. He believed that every object, every molecule, carried its own internal rhythm. If that rhythm could be engaged, matched, amplified, persuaded, then motion and power might emerge without fire, fuel, or force, not through pressure, but through sympathy. He called it vibrational harmony. Others would later call it impossible. Public demonstrations followed, staged not like factory tests, but like performances. Machinery stirred to life without visible engines. Heavy components shifted, lifted, turned, activated, it seemed, by carefully tuned sounds. Observers described a strange quietness. No steam, no combustion, just motion, arising from resonance. The inventor insisted that he was not breaking the laws of nature, only listening more closely to them. Energy, he argued, was already present everywhere, locked into matter itself. Sound was merely the key. At first, investors were intrigued. An engine that required no coal, no electricity, no moving pistons promised to upend the industrial order. Workshops imagined factories freed from smoke. Cities imagined power without infrastructure. But as interest grew, so did anxiety. An economy built on extraction does not adapt easily to ideas that bypass it. Requests for explanation became demands. How did it work? Where did the energy come from? Why could no one else reproduce it reliably? The inventor, protective of his methods and wary of misinterpretation, offered philosophy when others wanted schematics. That gap proved fatal. Funding collapsed. Accusations followed. After his death, investigators searched his workshop and announced that hidden mechanisms must have been responsible, that compressed air or concealed linkages explained the effects. To many, this settled the matter. The age of vibration gave way to the age of combustion and calculation. And yet, something lingered, because long after the controversy faded, science returned quietly to vibration. Quantum mechanics would reveal that matter is not solid, but oscillatory. Atoms hum. Particles behave like waves. Energy states are defined by frequency. The language changed, but the music remained. Modern engineers now design devices that exploit resonance with extreme precision. From ultrasound imaging to acoustic levitation, sound is no longer dismissed as merely auditory. It is structural. Even energy harvesting experiments explore how ambient vibrations might be converted into usable power. Was the 19th century inventor wrong? Perhaps in execution, perhaps in scale, but his intuition that nature responds to harmony was not absurd. It was simply ahead of its instrumentation. What history shows us here is not a hidden perpetual motion machine, but a recurring pattern. Ideas that rely on subtlety struggle in eras that reward force. Vibrational systems are sensitive. They require fine control, deep understanding, and patience. Industrial revolutions, by contrast, favor robustness and immediacy. Still, the emotional appeal is undeniable. To imagine engines that sing rather than burn, power drawn not by domination, but by alignment. It speaks to a gentler relationship with the world, one where technology collaborates with nature's rhythms instead of overpowering them. Whether such systems could ever scale to meet civilization's needs remains an open question. But the attempt itself reveals something important. Human progress is shaped not only by what works, but by what feels legible to its time. Some ideas fail because they are wrong, others because they are premature, and a few because they ask us to rethink not just machines, but how we listen. What happens when matter forgets how solid it is? By the late 20th century, physics had grown confident. Its equations could predict particles, power grids, and planetary motion with astonishing accuracy. The universe, it seemed, had rules, and humanity was learning to read them fluently. Yet in a small, improvised laboratory, far from academic centers, those rules appeared to bend in ways no textbook anticipated. The setup was chaotic by design. Multiple electromagnetic devices operated at once: coils, generators, radio frequency emitters, each producing fields that overlapped and interfered with one another. There was no single switch, no clean experiment isolated from its surroundings. Instead, the inventor watched what happened when complexity was allowed to accumulate. And something happened. Metal objects lifted slowly, as if unsure whether to obey gravity. Bars bent without heat. Dissimilar materials appeared to fuse together, not through force, but through proximity. Observers struggled to describe what they saw. Words like levitation and transformation felt dramatic, yet no simpler language seemed adequate. What made these events unsettling was not their scale, but their demeanor. Nothing exploded. Nothing glowed violently. The phenomena were almost casual, as though matter, briefly confused, had forgotten its own instructions. Witnesses included engineers and officials trained to doubt their senses. They checked for wires, magnets, hidden supports. They found none that explained the behavior fully. Reports were cautious, technical, stripped of speculation. Still, the implications were difficult to ignore. If electromagnetic fields could alter how matter behaved, its weight, structure, even composition, then the foundations of material science might be less rigid than assumed. Attention followed. Quiet attention. The laboratory did not become famous. It became inaccessible. Equipment was removed. Experiments ceased. Explanations were offered, then retracted. Officially, nothing conclusive had occurred. Unofficially, the questions lingered. Here, the narrative becomes especially delicate. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and reproducibility is the currency of science. Experiments dependent on complex field interactions are notoriously difficult to repeat. Small changes in configuration can produce entirely different outcomes. Without a clear theoretical framework, the observations remained anomalies. Interesting but isolated. Yet anomalies matter. They are the cracks through which new understanding sometimes enters. History is filled with moments when accepted models failed to explain what careful observers recorded. Most anomalies dissolve under scrutiny. A few reshape entire disciplines. In this case, the cost of uncertainty was hesitation. The possibility that fields could manipulate matter so profoundly carried enormous implications. Manufacturing, transportation, energy, defense, every domain would be affected. And with such implications comes caution, not necessarily suppression, but containment. A decision to move slowly, to study privately, to avoid premature conclusions. From a human perspective, this is understandable. From an emotional one, it is frustrating. Because the image of matter lifting itself, of solidity giving way to subtle influence, speaks to a deeper curiosity. It challenges the intuition that the world is fixed, heavy, and resistant. It suggests instead that reality may be more negotiable than we assume, responsive to patterns we do not yet know how to control. Modern physics, in its own way, echoes this humility. We now understand that mass arises from fields, that particles are excitations, that emptiness is anything but empty. The idea that electromagnetic interactions could influence material behavior is no longer fringe, it is foundational. What remains uncertain is how far that influence can extend. Were those late 20th century experiments glimpses of a broader principle or artifacts of misinterpretation? We may never know. The record is incomplete, the context lost. But the question they raised endures. Are the laws of physics as rigid as they appear, or do they soften at the intersections we rarely explore? Perhaps the most important insight here is not about levitation or transformation, but about complexity itself. When systems become dense with interaction, new behaviors emerge, often unexpected, sometimes profound. And it is in those emergent spaces where certainty thins and curiosity sharpens that science is reminded of its limits. Not as a failure, but as an invitation. What if life itself was powered by something we forgot how to name? In the mid-20th century, biology and physics stood at an uneasy crossroads. Medicine had grown increasingly chemical, focused on compounds, dosages, and measurable reactions. Physics, meanwhile, was diving ever deeper into abstraction, mapping forces invisible to the senses. Between them lay an unanswered question. Was life merely a biochemical machine, or did it participate in broader energetic processes still poorly understood? Some researchers believed the answer mattered deeply. They observed that living organisms behaved differently from inert matter. Cells generated electrical potentials. Nerves communicated through pulses. Bodies produced heat, motion, and growth that seemed to exceed what simple mechanical explanations could fully describe. These scientists spoke carefully, often metaphorically, about vital energy, not as mysticism, but as a placeholder for something real but undefined. Experiments followed that aimed to isolate and concentrate this elusive vitality. Simple-looking devices were built from alternating layers of organic and metallic materials arranged in deliberate patterns. The theory was straightforward, if unconventional. If the environment carried subtle energy, perhaps biological systems could be supported by collecting and focusing it. The devices were not dramatic. They hummed with quiet intention rather than spectacle. Early reports described modest but intriguing effects. Temperature differences that defied easy explanation. Plants that appeared to grow more vigorously. Patients who reported improved well-being, faster recovery, or renewed energy. Nothing miraculous, just enough to provoke curiosity and concern. Medical authorities demanded rigorous proof. Regulators questioned safety and claims. The language used by proponents, blending psychology, biology, and field theory, did not fit cleanly into established categories. Without standardized metrics, interpretation varied wildly. Supporters saw promise. Critics saw risk. The debate escalated quickly, fueled by fear on both sides. On one hand, the danger of false hope. On the other, the possibility that something genuinely useful was being dismissed because it did not align with prevailing models. The middle ground again proved fragile. Legal pressure mounted. Research was halted. Devices destroyed. Publications removed. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with silence. Looking back, it is easy to caricature this moment as a battle between innovation and authority. But reality is rarely so clean. Institutions exist to protect people from harm, but they also struggle with ambiguity. When evidence is incomplete and language imprecise, caution often becomes prohibition. And yet, the core idea did not disappear. Today, medicine openly studies bioelectricity. Fields like psychoneuroimmunology explore how mental states influence physical health. Environmental factors, light, temperature, electromagnetic exposure, are recognized as shaping biological outcomes. Even the idea that layered materials can affect energy flow finds echoes in modern shielding, insulation, and architectural design. What changed was not the curiosity, but the vocabulary. The term life force faded, replaced by measurable proxies. The question, however, remains remarkably similar. How deeply are living systems intertwined with their energetic environment? And how much of health depends on balance rather than intervention? This chapter is not about a forgotten cure or a hidden power source. It is about discomfort with ideas that blur boundaries. When biology sounds like physics and physics sounds like philosophy, institutions often retreat to safer ground. But progress does not only come from certainty, it also comes from exploring the edges where definitions fail. Perhaps the lesson here is not that life runs on mysterious energy, but that our models of life are always incomplete. They evolve, they shed language and adopt new forms. What once seemed unscientific can, over time, become foundational, once we learn how to ask the question properly. And so the quiet inquiry continues. Not into miracles, but into understanding. Not into domination, but into relationship. Because living systems are not machines alone. They are conversations with themselves and with the world around them. What if the past knew something we no longer practice? On a quiet stretch of land in southern Florida, an unlikely structure takes shape from coral stone. Walls, gates, and towers, some weighing as much as a loaded truck, stand arranged with deliberate precision. There are no records of heavy machinery, no photographs of cranes or crews. Only the work itself, completed slowly, mostly at night, by a single man. Visitors who arrived later struggled with a simple question: how? The builder spoke sparingly. He said he understood the principles behind the great monuments of antiquity, that the builders of pyramids and stone temples had not relied solely on brute force, but on a deeper understanding of balance, leverage, and unseen forces. He referred often to magnetism, not as a metaphor, but as a literal current moving through the world. At first, such claims were dismissed as eccentricity. After all, history is full of individuals who surround their work with mystery. But the stones themselves resisted easy explanations. Blocks weighing many tons were positioned with remarkable accuracy. Some balanced so precisely that a child could set them in motion. Others fit together with a precision that challenged assumptions about primitive tools. Witnesses occasionally described strange scenes. The builder working alone under moonlight, massive stones seemingly shifting with unnatural ease. These accounts were inconsistent, anecdotal, and impossible to verify. Yet the finished structure remained, silent, immovable, undeniable. Engineers who later examined the site offered conventional explanations: careful use of pulleys, exceptional patience, ingenious application of leverage, all plausible, all insufficient to fully explain the consistency and scale of the work. The truth, most agreed, lay somewhere between genius craftsmanship and missing information. After the builder's death, his workshop was cleared, tools removed, notes disappeared. The mystery did not deepen so much as it evaporated, leaving behind only the result. The stones stayed. The method vanished. This pattern is familiar. Across cultures and centuries, we encounter structures that seem to exceed the capabilities attributed to their time, not because ancient people were mystical, but because knowledge is not linear. Techniques emerge, serve a purpose, then fade when conditions change. What is lost is not intelligence, but context. In this case, magnetism became a focal point of speculation. Modern physics understands magnetic fields as fundamental, subtle, and pervasive. We use them to store data, guide navigation, image the human body. Yet their relationship to gravity remains only partially explored. The idea that someone might intuitively manipulate magnetic balance without formal theory feels improbable, but not impossible. What matters more than the mechanism is the attitude behind it. The builder did not rush. He did not scale. He did not publish. His work was personal, almost devotional. It valued alignment over efficiency, precision over speed, understanding over explanation. In a world increasingly defined by industrial acceleration, such an approach feels alien. And yet, the structure stands as a reminder that technological progress is not always about adding complexity. Sometimes it is about removing assumptions. Perhaps the real question is not whether stones once floated, but whether we have narrowed our imagination about what counts as valid knowledge. When a method cannot be easily replicated or monetized, it often slips from collective memory, regardless of its effectiveness. This is not a call to romanticize the past or distrust modern engineering. It is an invitation to humility, to recognize that human ingenuity has always taken multiple forms, many of which do not survive the passage of institutions. The stones remain, quietly holding their position. They do not explain themselves. They do not argue. They simply suggest that understanding can exist without documentation, and that some questions are carried forward not by answers, but by wonder. What if power was drawn not by explosion, but by return? For most of modern history, progress has moved outward. Engines burn fuel, gases expand, pistons drive forward. Energy is released violently, harnessed in moments of pressure and heat. From steam to combustion to jet propulsion, the logic has remained remarkably consistent. Force the world apart, and motion will follow. But some inventors questioned that assumption. They looked to nature, not to fire, but to flow. To whirlpools forming effortlessly in rivers, to air currents spiraling inward rather than bursting outward. They wondered whether energy might be gathered by concentration instead of release, whether motion could emerge from cooling rather than heating. It was a counterintuitive idea in an age obsessed with power measured in blasts. One such inventor became fascinated with vortices. He observed that water, when guided into specific spiral paths, behaved differently. It cooled as it accelerated. It purified itself. It seemed to gain coherence rather than chaos. From these observations emerged a radical proposal: engines that worked by implosion, drawing energy inward through carefully shaped movement. Early prototypes were quiet, almost unsettlingly so. They did not roar or vibrate. Instead, they hummed, producing motion while appearing to defy the inefficiencies that plagued conventional machines. Reports describe devices that became more efficient over time, not less. Exhaust that was cool, clean, even restorative to surrounding air and water. To some, this sounded like fantasy. To others, especially those concerned with efficiency and sustainability, it sounded like a future worth exploring. Interest followed, cautiously at first, then urgently. In times of conflict, any advantage, especially one that promised silent operation and exceptional performance, drew attention. Research was redirected, applications reconsidered. The work continued, but no longer in public view. After the wars ended, the inventor returned to a changed world. Industrial systems had standardized. Energy infrastructure favored scale, uniformity, predictability. Implosion engines, delicate and context-sensitive, did not fit easily into mass production. Worse, their principles challenged the dominant intuition of engineering itself. To accept them would require rethinking not just machines but assumptions about how energy behaves. Contracts were signed, control shifted, development stalled, the inventor's health declined. When he died, his ideas lingered mostly in fragments, notes, second-hand accounts, and a handful of experimental recreations that achieved partial success. Once again, certainty proved elusive. Modern fluid dynamics now confirms many of the underlying observations. Vortices are efficient. Spiral flows reduce friction. Nature favors inward-turning structures, from hurricanes to galaxies. Engineers design turbines and pumps that exploit these principles, albeit within conventional frameworks. What was lost was not the science, but the ambition to reorganize energy systems around a different philosophy. Explosion is easy to measure. Implosion is subtle. It requires patience, precision, and restraint, qualities that rarely dominate industrial timelines. And so the inward-turning engine remained an outsider, admired quietly, pursued cautiously, never fully embraced. This story is not about a hidden machine waiting to save the world. It is about the limits of imagination shaped by habit. When a society becomes fluent in one way of doing things, alternatives, no matter how elegant, struggle to gain traction. Yet the appeal endures. A machine that cools as it works. Power that cleans rather than pollutes. Motion born from harmony instead of force. These ideas persist not because they promise miracles, but because they reflect a longing to align technology more closely with natural processes. To move with the world, not against it. Perhaps the future of energy will not belong solely to engines that burn brighter and faster. Perhaps it will also make room for those that turn inward, quietly, patiently, gathering strength where we once assumed none could exist. What if power could lift itself? By the middle of the 20th century, humanity had learned how to fly, but not how to let go. Aircraft rose by burning fuel, pushing air downward in acts of calculated violence. Rockets escaped Earth by shedding mass in stages, leaving scorched paths behind them. Flight was a triumph, but an expensive one, paid for in noise, fuel, and constant compromise. Yet in small workshops and temporary laboratories, a different idea circulated. It began with magnets. Magnetism had always felt strange. Force without contact, influence across emptiness. Engineers understood how to use it to generate electricity and motion, but a few noticed something unexpected. Under particular arrangements, magnetic systems appeared to reduce their own weight. Bearings felt lighter. Rotors resisted gravity less than expected. Occasionally, devices seemed to hover, briefly, as if undecided about which way was down. At first, these observations were dismissed as measurement errors. Instruments can lie. Expectations can bias perception. But the reports persisted, scattered across continents and decades, always vague enough to evade confirmation, yet consistent enough to provoke curiosity. Some inventors pushed further. They built generators designed not only to produce electricity, but to interact dynamically with magnetic fields. Rotating elements were arranged in precise geometries, their motion creating complex field patterns that evolved as the system ran. Witnesses described machines that powered external loads while simultaneously exhibiting lift, subtle, unstable, but undeniable to those who saw it. The implications were unsettling. A generator that reduced its own weight challenged foundational assumptions. Energy generation and propulsion had always been separate problems. Here, they appeared intertwined. If a system could produce power while partially freeing itself from gravity, then motion might become an emergent property, rather than a forced one. Demonstrations attracted attention from regulators before they attracted widespread belief. Concerns were raised about electromagnetic interference. Safety standards were invoked, permits denied, equipment confiscated. Official explanations focused on compliance, not capability. As before, the line between caution and containment blurred. From a scientific standpoint, skepticism was justified. Magnetic systems are notoriously complex. Hidden inputs, overlooked losses, and misinterpreted forces can easily mislead even experienced engineers. Reproducibility remained elusive. Designs varied. Results depended heavily on fine-tuning. Without a robust theoretical framework, the claims hovered uncomfortably between innovation and illusion. But from a human standpoint, something else was happening. The idea of motion without weight touched a nerve. It suggested freedom from the infrastructure that defined modern life: fuel depots, grids, pipelines, supply chains. A device that carried its own power and lift implied autonomy on a scale rarely imagined. Modern physics does not forbid all such possibilities outright. We know that mass and energy are equivalent, We know that fields contribute to inertia. We know that under extreme conditions, matter behaves in ways that defy everyday intuition. What we do not yet know is how to harness these relationships reliably, safely, and economically. That gap between theoretical permission and practical control is where many ideas fade. Some magnetic innovators continued quietly, refining prototypes, documenting anomalies, seeking patterns. Others gave up, worn down by regulation, expense, and doubt. Over time, the conversation drifted to the margins, replaced by more predictable technologies that scaled cleanly and explained themselves well. Still, the question remains, why does the dream of self-lifting machines persist across generations? Perhaps because it speaks to more than engineering. It reflects a desire to escape dependence, not just on gravity, but on systems that bind movement to consumption. Whether these magnetic experiments revealed a genuine principle or simply the limits of perception, they remind us of something essential. Progress is not only about what can be proven today, but about which questions we choose to keep alive. Because sometimes the future begins not with certainty, but with a machine that feels just a little lighter than it should. What if distance were not fixed, but negotiable? During times of war, imagination accelerates. Urgency compresses ethics, budgets, and patience into a single directive: find an advantage. In the early 1940s, as global conflict stretched technology to its limits, scientists explored ideas that would have seemed unthinkable in peacetime. Among them was a question as audacious as it was unsettling. Could space itself be altered? The theory was abstract, almost poetic. If gravity and electromagnetism were not separate forces but expressions of a deeper structure, then perhaps intense fields could reshape the fabric in which matter existed, not by moving objects through space, but by changing how space behaved around them. The goal, initially, was modest: invisibility, confuse radar, reduce detection, bend signals away from their targets. What followed, according to later accounts, was not what anyone expected. Observers described a vessel surrounded by humming generators, wrapped in powerful electromagnetic fields. As the system activated, the air seemed to shimmer. The outline of the ship softened, then vanished, not cloaked, but absent. Water rushed inward, as if filling a void. Moments later, far from its starting point, the vessel reappeared just as suddenly. These stories are difficult to hold. They arrive burdened with exaggeration, rumor, and decades of retelling. Official records deny the event outright. Witnesses contradict one another. Technical details remain frustratingly vague. And yet the narrative persists, not as proof, but as a provocation, because the idea it gestures toward is not fantasy. Modern physics openly entertains concepts once dismissed as science fiction. Space-time can curve. Time dilates. Quantum states link across distance. None of this allows for casual teleportation, but it reminds us that reality is more flexible than intuition suggests. The question is not whether space can behave strangely, but how much control we can exert over that behavior. In the alleged experiment, control was the missing element. Accounts describe disorientation, psychological trauma, and physical harm. Whatever forces were unleashed, they were not fully understood. If space was distorted, so too were the human beings caught within it. The cost was too high, the risk too great. The project, real or rumored, was abandoned, buried beneath layers of denial and classification. From an ethical perspective, this makes sense. Technologies that alter perception, location, or time itself challenge our most basic assumptions about safety and identity. To step instantly from one place to another is not merely a technical feat. It is a philosophical rupture. What happens to continuity, to responsibility, to the meaning of presence? Even today, with vastly more sophisticated tools, humanity approaches such questions cautiously. Quantum teleportation transfers information, not matter. Relativistic effects are accounted for, not exploited. The frontier is explored slowly, deliberately, aware of its fragility. So why does this story endure? Perhaps because it captures a moment when ambition outpaced wisdom, when the desire to master reality ignored the cost of misunderstanding it. Whether literal or symbolic, the narrative warns us that not every door should be forced open. It also reflects a deeper longing to escape distance, to arrive without travel, to transcend the slow grind of movement that defines human limitation. That longing has driven innovation for centuries, from roads to ships to aircraft to digital communication. Each step reduces separation. Each introduces new responsibilities. The dream of instant presence is simply the latest expression of an ancient impulse. If such technology ever becomes possible, it will demand not secrecy, but maturity. Not fear, but humility. Because bending space is not just an engineering challenge, it is a moral one. And perhaps the lesson of this shadowed chapter is not that teleportation was achieved and hidden, but that humanity glimpsed how dangerous it can be to treat reality as a system to be overridden rather than understood. Some distances, we may learn, exist for a reason. What happens to ideas that arrive without a place to land? By now, a pattern has emerged. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but a recurring human response to uncertainty. An idea appears that unsettles established categories. It resists clean measurement. It promises transformation without offering reassurance. And rather than being resolved, it is deferred, set aside until language, tools, or incentives catch up. History is full of such deferrals. In laboratories that never made headlines, inventors struggled with concepts that refused to become products. Their work sat in notebooks, in half-finished machines, in conversations that ended with shrugs rather than conclusions. Some were dismissed as eccentrics. Others were quietly redirected. Most simply ran out of time. What united them was not brilliance alone, but isolation. Science advances through communities, through replication, critique, and shared standards. Ideas that cannot enter that ecosystem because they are too complex, too poorly defined, or too disruptive, often wither regardless of their potential. This is not malice. It is inertia. And yet the emotional toll is real. For an inventor, an idea is not an abstraction. It is years of attention, intuition, and hope. When that work is ignored or sidelined, the loss feels personal. The world did not merely reject a hypothesis. It rejected a vision of what might be possible. In many of the stories we've explored, the final chapters are quiet. Legal disputes, financial exhaustion, retreat into obscurity. The absence of closure leaves space for myth, and myth fills silence with intention. Suppression becomes an explanation, not because it is always accurate, but because it provides meaning where ambiguity hurts. But there is another way to read these endings. Some ideas fail, not because they threaten power, but because they lack a supporting ecosystem. A free energy concept without materials science to stabilize it. A medical insight without clinical frameworks to test it. A propulsion anomaly without theory to predict its limits. Discovery does not exist in isolation. It requires scaffolding. When that scaffolding is missing, even promising ideas collapse under their own weight. This does not make the pursuit foolish. It makes it human. Consider how many concepts once dismissed later found their place. Continental drift, germ theory, the existence of galaxies beyond our own. Each spent decades in intellectual limbo, not suppressed but unready. The difference between neglect and persecution often lies not in intent, but in narrative distance. From this perspective, the erased inventions of the past look less like stolen futures and more like unanswered questions, paused rather than buried. Yet pause has consequences. Every delay reshapes the path forward. Energy systems harden, Medical models entrench. Infrastructure accumulates. By the time an alternative becomes viable, the cost of transition may feel too high. What might have been possible once becomes impractical later, not because it was wrong, but because the world moved on. This is the quiet tragedy of innovation. Not that breakthroughs are hidden, but that timing is unforgiving. So perhaps the real issue is not whether these inventions worked, but whether our systems are capable of holding fragile ideas long enough for them to mature. Whether curiosity can survive without immediate utility. Whether we can tolerate uncertainty without demanding instant resolution. In an age increasingly driven by metrics, returns, and acceleration, this question feels urgent. Because the future will bring ideas just as strange, just as unsettling as those we've revisited here. Some will be illusions, some will be seeds, and how we respond will determine which stories are remembered as failures, and which quietly become foundations. The cost of knowing too soon is confusion. The cost of knowing too late is regret. Between those costs lies a narrow window where imagination and patience must coexist, and history suggests we rarely linger there for long. What remains when possibility passes us by? If you step back far enough, history begins to look less like a straight line and more like a branching path, one where countless directions briefly appear, then narrow, then disappear. The stories we've traced are not isolated curiosities. Together, they form a shadow map of alternatives, futures imagined, tested in fragments, and ultimately left behind. What is striking is how ordinary these moments often were at the time. No thunderclaps, no declarations that the world was about to change forever, just workshops closing, grants denied, projects reframed, people moving on. The future did not collapse. It simply leaned in another direction. And once momentum builds, it is difficult to reverse. Energy systems grew centralized, medicine grew specialized, transportation grew louder and faster. Each choice made sense within its context. Each solved real problems efficiently. But every choice also excluded other possibilities, approaches that were slower, subtler, harder to standardize. Over time, those excluded paths came to feel implausible, not because they had been disproven, but because they no longer fit the world that had formed around them. This is how technological inevitability is born. We tell ourselves that what exists is what was always going to exist, that the grid had to look this way, that engines had to burn this fuel, that medicine had to take this form. In reality, these outcomes were shaped by timing, economics, personalities, and chance as much as by physics. The erased inventions we've explored sit at the edges of that realization. They remind us that progress is not only a matter of discovery, but of adoption. An idea can be valid in principle and still fail in practice. Another can be imperfect, yet thrive because it integrates cleanly with existing systems. Neither outcome is purely rational. From a human perspective, this creates a quiet unease. If the world we inhabit is only one of many plausible versions, what responsibilities do we carry for the ones we didn't choose? Are we obligated to revisit them? Or is letting go part of growth? There is no simple answer. Some ideas are best left behind. They are stepping stones, not destinations. Others may deserve revisiting, not as lost miracles, but as inspirations reframed through modern understanding. The goal is not to resurrect the past, but to learn from its unfinished questions. In recent years, this re-examination has begun, carefully. Scientists explore distributed energy. Engineers design quieter, cleaner motion. Medicine studies systems rather than symptoms. Physics confronts the limits of its own models with renewed humility. None of this requires belief in hidden breakthroughs. It requires openness to complexity, and perhaps that is the most valuable inheritance these stories offer. They teach us that innovation is fragile, that curiosity needs protection not only from censorship, but from impatience, that ideas which challenge the structure of society must be met not just with excitement, but with responsibility. Most of all, they remind us that the future is not something that arrives fully formed. It is assembled, choice by choice, often without our realizing what we are setting aside. As we stand at the threshold of new technologies that will redefine energy, health, and movement once again, the past offers a quiet caution. Not to fear bold ideas, not to chase every anomaly, but to remain aware that today's decisions will one day be someone else's history. And that history will ask its own question. Which futures did we consider, and which did we let slip away? What does humanity owe to the ideas it leaves unfinished? In the end, history is not only written in achievements. It is written in pauses. Between one accepted discovery and the next lies a vast, quiet space filled with attempts that never matured, questions that lost momentum, and visions that arrived without a home. These are not failures in the simple sense. They are the negative space of progress, the outlines of what might have been. The inventions and ideas we've explored across this journey do not form a single hidden truth. They form something more subtle, a record of human curiosity pressing against the boundaries of its era. Some of those boundaries were scientific, others were economic, institutional, or cultural. Many were emotional, the fear of being wrong, the risk of destabilizing what already worked. What remains striking is how human these stories are. Inventors driven by intuition rather than certainty. Institutions guided by caution rather than malice. Societies choosing stability over disruption, often without realizing the long-term consequences of that choice. No villains, no saviors. Just people navigating uncertainty with incomplete information. This perspective matters. Because when we frame the past as a struggle between truth and suppression, we miss the deeper lesson. Progress is not blocked only by power. It is shaped by readiness, by whether an idea can be tested, understood, integrated, and governed responsibly. Without those conditions, even the most beautiful insight can become untenable. And yet, the emotional pull of these stories persists for a reason. They speak to a shared intuition that reality is richer than our current explanations, that nature still holds relationships we haven't fully mapped, that some questions were abandoned not because they were meaningless, but because they were inconvenient, premature, or too difficult to hold. Modern science, at its best, acknowledges this humility. It no longer claims to have final answers, only better approximations. It revisits old ideas with new tools. It reframes intuition in the language of measurement. In doing so, it quietly redeems parts of the past, not by resurrecting myths, but by translating curiosity into clarity. The future will demand this balance even more. Emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, new energy systems will pose questions as disruptive as any we've discussed. Some ideas will feel unsettling. Others will seem implausible until suddenly they are not. How we respond will determine whether tomorrow's histories are written with wisdom or regret. Perhaps the most important insight from this journey is not about lost inventions, but about attention, what we choose to explore deeply, what we choose to dismiss quickly, what we choose to protect long enough for understanding to grow. Because progress does not only depend on boldness, it depends on patience, on restraint, on the willingness to sit with uncertainty without rushing to either belief or rejection. In that sense, the so-called erased inventions of history are not warnings of hidden truths, nor evidence of stolen futures. They are reminders of how fragile the path of knowledge can be, and how easily it narrows when curiosity is rushed or polarized. The world we live in is not the only world that was possible, but it is the one we are responsible for now. And as we move forward, carrying both the achievements and the silences of those who came before us, perhaps the most timeless question we can ask is this: When the next unfamiliar idea arrives, quiet, incomplete, and challenging, will we listen long enough to understand it? Or will it, too, fade into the space between discoveries, waiting for another time, another language, another generation ready to hear it?